Hello and welcome everyone to a new Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I am joined tonight by Mark, Murray, and Lindsay. And we're all going to talk about reenactment and experimental archaeology and what we can learn from that and where the limits are, and what is good and maybe not so good about it. And we might have opinions, but we only have one person with some experience. I don't count myself. The photos are somewhere online, but woe betide the person who tries to find them. And we've got quite a few questions that we could work off of. I've grouped them a little bit. I think let's talk about the most perhaps the most attractive, the most obvious aspect of reenactment, and that is, how does it help to generate interest and educating the public? Is it an easy gimme? Lindsay, you've done it. How does the public react when you show up in Roman gear?
Well, it's interesting. It depends on the country you do it in, actually. So I was a member of the Ermine Street Guard. So plug for Ermine Street Guard. There's the badge there.
The most famous British reenactment group.
Well, it will claim, and I think rightly so, the world's oldest and still the best. There's probably howls from the world, but the best. It was founded in 1972. It's had a very, very long, distinguished history. Chris Haynes, I think it's OBE now, actually heads it up. The reaction of the audience is typically one filled with slight awe. It comes down to how you do the performance. So an Ermine Street Guard performance consists of a sort of lecture, if you will, and it's a very well organized explanation of what the Legion is, the arms and equipment. Of course, the joke is that ladies in the audience might like to grab themselves a Roman soldier and examine his arms and equipment. That always gets a titter. And then you go into a sort of formation drill, and the final thing ends up with a cunium, a charge using the wedge formation, which is precision ballet, if you will, because we just stop before we actually crash into the audience. And of course, the kids
hopefully without anybody stumbling. And
well, that's exactly right. And we've had, well, I say we. I mean, the Ermine Street Guard, to my knowledge, has never had an accident, and I think that's down to the fact that it's a very disciplined outfit. I can't really speak about the other units. I know there are something like 30, possibly even 40 worldwide. In fact,
I made a list one time. There's a lot more. But there's a lot of very small groups that consist.
Yeah, well, Martin McCarry in Ireland, in fact, on Facebook, I think, tried to run a sort of a register of all of these groups. There are several here. There was one in Austin for a while. It disappeared. But anyway, so the audience is typically bemused, very respectful, very excited. And when, in fact, you break up and you stand around, people come up. And it ranges from the history was never taught like this at school. If only they had, I'd have been really engaged and excited, to kids coming up and want to hold your sword, or your gladius in this case, and have you killed anybody with this? They'll typically ask, and I always felt like saying no, but there's always a first time. So really, I think the response is usually immensely positive. It has the ability to bring something very much alive. People are used to seeing pictures or fragments in museums, and for the first time for many people it's there in reality for them, and it's quite marvelous. It's a cross between edutainment and I suppose living history.
Fair enough. I think the last part especially is stands out, I think, because we see these helmets usually not always in the best shape, and you see bits of armor, and you see maybe a sword or a dagger lying next to it, and then you see it for the first time all put together on an actual live human being.
Well, here's an example. This is my Imperial Gallantry G, which I helped. Actually had a major part in making, as it was. And all Ermine Street Guard members are expected to at least make their own caligae. And the reason you do that is because you learn very quickly, if you have an ill-fitting pair of caligae, you get blisters on your feet really very, very quickly. And you're encouraged to make the rest of your armor. What's extraordinary about the process of making is the discovery of what the functionality of the armor equipment actually is. And some of it is experimental. I mean, some of the fragments that these things are modeled on are in really bad shape. And of course, you're using your best judgment. But as information becomes available, people actually rebuild and revise the designs. And a simple one I can think of is the baldric, which goes over the shoulder to hold the scabbard. For the longest time was thought to have a buckle on it. And a lot of reenactors have this kind of buckle, and it was discovered that actually probably the buckle was not actually what it was intended for. In fact, it's a complete loop of leather. And in fact, I think the Ministry Guard basically banned the use of those catches on baldricks, and we all had to make new ones. So it's a living history too. As new information comes along, you make the adjustments, of course.
Yeah, perhaps it'd be interesting in the discussion to distinguish, distinguish some things in that the experimental archaeology and reenactment, it consists of different parts. There's all that equipment that has to be remade, reproduced, recreated. You can discuss, what starts where. You can see. You could say you just have to make something that looks like the original, and there's actually trying to recreate it in a way that you use preferably the same alloys, you use the same kind of wood, bone, and other materials, and you try to make them in the same way that the ancients might try to make them. It all teaches you different things. And then there's putting it all on and using it and see what you learn by doing that.
That's true. And I think what a lot of these reenactment groups is, they start with a lot of enthusiasm and try the best they can to build things. And what you rapidly discover is that there's a member of your team who's actually very good at annealing. Someone's very good at detailed metal work, or someone's very good at leather work. And you sort of all pitch in, and as these skills mature and other people come into the group, that you make these things better. Some of these things are now commercially available, remarkably. That there are factories
Quite
in
a few
India.
now.
Yeah, and there are some of these. I think Dan Peterson has been an advisor for at least one of these companies. So some of them are a reasonably good standard. Of course, the perfectionists would say, well, that they're factory produced, and therefore they by definition can't be very good copies. But I think what's happened over the decades is that the game has been raised, and there's a great deal of enthusiasm now for looking at the quality of the work. Some of the enamel work on some of these daggers, for example, is quite extraordinary. And I have to say that it's amazing also when you see a full unit turned out. The Ministry Guard's about 40 people. And everybody was paid so much attention to detail, and can typically say, well, this is based on the Mainz scabbard, or this is from Xanten or somewhere. So you actually get to see a sort of living series of museum collections as well. The great thing about a lot of these reenactment groups is that they really try to bring authenticity to the subject of reconstruction, reenactment, and living history.
And then the interesting part is sometimes that you get, it's almost an in-crowd joke, I believe, that you get reconstructions that are better made than the originals. As in, when you look at the originals, they're often clearly, they show traces of having been made perhaps in mass, certainly in series, and by people who are perhaps not interested in making the most perfect product. And then you get like those enamel decorations that are not perfectly symmetrical on both sides of the helmet head, for instance.
And I think that's an important point, is that we apply a sort of exact, precise factory precision, which was non-existent before the Industrial Revolution, pretty much. So there was this wide variety in appearance and quality of manufacture. And I would imagine a modern person looking at an authentic 1st or 2nd century Roman legion would be quite appalled at some of the things that you'd see. I mean, things aren't balanced and they don't weigh properly, but that's the reality of it.
Absolutely. Perhaps that just sort of moves us easily into the questions of modern biases and authenticity. it is probably, as you said, it's easy to see how you can reproduce something if you found it. It's been archaeologically examined. We have some idea of the composition of materials. We know what it looks like. You can reproduce it, even if you can reproduce something so that it looks like the original, weighs the same, feels the same. But if you put it all on, does it, what's the experience from inside the group, Lindsay? Does it make you feel like a Roman soldier, or do you feel like a modern person wearing a collection of museum items, as you said?
Well, I think that's a very personal thing. I think that, that there are different responses. I mean, I'm always conscious I'm a 21st century person with a passion for the subject. And when I was wearing the equipment, I had all the failings and limitations. I mean, I'm not toughened like a Roman trooper that's marching, was it 10, 15, 20 miles a day? I mean, that's just not how we are. But we actually did have people who were hikers and archaeologists and former soldiers who, did those sorts of things and probably approached the subject differently. But and there are people who really seem to assume this persona where they think they are Roman soldiers. I wasn't one of those people. I think the interesting thing as a researcher and as a writer is feeling the weight of the equipment, how in fact it's remarkably flexible. If you're wearing scale armor or chainmail or even the segmented plate armor, the surprise is actually that when you hold this thing in your hands, it's blooming heavy. It's about 10 kilos or something, 22 pounds or odd, and you put it on and it does form you. And then there are the atmospherics aspects. In a very hot and humid climate, it becomes very uncomfortable very quickly. People who polish their armor with a fine finish get brutally disappointed when, of course, the skies open and it rains. And of course, our rain tends to be acid or acidic to some degree, and very quickly you get these little burn marks in your metal, which then raises the question: how did the ancient army polish its equipment? We know that it sort of shone to some degree, but was it really this fine precision polishing that we have today? And I highly doubt that. I was going to actually move the subject slightly onto the subject, for example, where archaeology can be helpful. I do apologize. I've got one of these nuisance calls again. I get those every day. It's a problem here in the States, as Mark sent us today. I was going to say, for example, in the area of leatherwork, particularly tents, I'm thinking several years ago, the Untitled Street Guard helped Carol van Driel Murray. I think she was doing her dissertation. And in fact, the Guard actually built large pieces, if not the entire tent. And in fact, it was actually phenomenal to be able to see the functionality and the real practicality of Roman materials and the stitching and all of this coming together. And in fact, how really functional this thing was compared to canvas. So, for example, the Street Guard would typically set up a little camp scene, and for the longest time it was canvas tents, and you'd have sort of tent pegs and all this sort of thing. And it was a hybrid between modern materials and Roman design. But the Street Guard's gone that extra distance now and actually has built proper leather tents in the light of that information that Carol van Driel Murray was able to find, and that's wonderful, because now you get to experience other aspects of camp life that you would not otherwise have. And I think that's one of the great things of reenactment, and that sort of whole aspect brings to the study and experience of history too.
I think one of the biggest issues with the bias question is, of course, that there will be historians who claim that reenactors are not real historians and that what they do isn't real history. Real history is reading books, and I think that's one of the major problems that there's been in the past. But people like Peter Connolly and others have shown, and as Lindsay's just been saying, the exactitude that a lot of these reenactors bring to their reenactment is actually as rigorous as a conventional historian. And I think that, they do the research and they go and look at the real thing and they weigh it and they measure it and then they reproduce it. And through that, they find techniques that, a pen and paper historian, for lack of a better word, will never even consider, because that's not what our written sources provide. And so that the exactitude they bring is not the same as an empirical historian, but it's just as valid. And I think the worry often was that not every reenactor is as exacting in their standards as others, and historians would tend to tar every reenactor with the same brush. That all reenactment is bad because this reenactor is bad, or that, like Lindsay was saying, when they learn something new, they would change it, as opposed to they made a mistake with this one thing that they made, and that's not, we don't know how that was done, so they can't reproduce it, or they've made it wrong. They've come to a solution of, I need some way of making this, and therefore this is my solution. And I think that because of those errors, and again, as Lindsay said, they're very willing to admit those errors very often, as opposed to written historians who would never ever admit that they made a mistake in the interpretation of an archaeological or literary source, or that there could be more than one. And I think one of the other perils of today, of course, is that with so much internet scholarship, you can find an outmoded theory that's been debunked for centuries, well, not centuries, but certainly decades, making a reappearance because someone wants to include it on their website. And then someone will quote to you that old outmoded theory as a modern, up-to-date theory because it's on a brand new website. And that's very similar, I think, in the sense that you've just got to go and look at each individual thing and do your own research rather than rely on someone else's. So I think that at its best, reenactment can bring amazing insights to, archaeology and history and the interpretation of, how these amazing groups of men from the ancient world did the things that they claim they did. Because we read about legions doing this and legions doing that and phalanxes doing this. And then when you actually lift one or wear one or put one on, it's amazing how that becomes more real as opposed to a detached sort of intellectual exercise.
I think there's a couple of things, and I think I hit a lot of things on the nail there, Murray. The one thing I'd point out, so for example, in the 10 years or so I was with the Union Street Guard as a full participating member, many of the people that were actually in the society were themselves either archaeologists, either as practicing, or they were students, and historians. And of course, we can go into what qualifies you for an historian discussion. That's probably another podcast. But I think the one thing I would point out is that the people who do this do it because they want it to be authentic. I mean, they're spending their time and money often, and certainly energies in trying to make this thing as real and authentic. There's a genuine pride in getting it right. That there are some units, I would say, I'm not going to mention them, but that you can find them on Facebook, for example, who then go an nth degree, and then they sort of assume this persona of a Roman soldier and sort of come up with films and all sorts of interesting scenes which they film, and I think they glorify the violence and other aspects, which I don't believe, certainly speaking kind of as an unofficial spokesman of the Union Street Guard, that's not what the Union Street Guard would do. I mean, ours was an educational mission, and so, for example, we would go to the Limes conference, and what was very interesting that you'd actually see sometimes there would be people who were speaking about subjects, and they'd come from Hungary and Romania and all sorts of parts of the UK, and they had for the first time seen what an Imperial Gallantry G, as we call it, helmet looked like, or they'd never actually felt the weight of some of this equipment, and it was quite a revelation for them. So in fact, I think that you could actually, in that respect, change people's prejudices and biases, because now I can see how this is useful. So you can actually move them out of the academic paper historian mindset into something that suddenly goes, that explains why that happens in that way in the texts, for example.
I think the other thing is that what you find with some reenactors is that they weaponize their reenactment expertise to be like Jasper was talking about. I am a Roman soldier. I am, and you aren't, and I know what I'm talking about. And I think that kind of, and if you're sitting there going, but we don't have a surviving example of this thing you're showing me, and I think that kind of attitude really puts a lot of people offside. But I think the best examples are the ones who don't, that they're striving to understand and they're striving to build it right, and that's in its own way the most remarkable endeavor. I mean, the closest I've come to reenactment is I played Attila the Hun on stage, and I also played a very overweight Ethiopian prisoner of war in Aida. So there's that strange thing, and there's a famous quote by Charlton Heston, who played El Cid, that because he played El Cid and they had all the crowds chanting his name, he knew what it was to take a city because he'd done it. And I think lots of method actors have got into that sort of issue where they get confused about whether they are the person they're portraying because that's what their mind is telling them. And that's like, well, no, you're not that person because you don't have any of the background, regardless of how deep your immersion has been. And I think that is a bit of a worrying sign when someone loses their own identity and thinks that they're someone else, especially in a historical term, because as you say, our mindset is a modern mindset. We have standards of industrialization that the ancient world never had. We have, types of helmet that are defined by this fancy labeling system, and we have one example, or we have one example that doesn't fit the labeling system, and it's either given its own label or it's called an anomaly and it's rejected from the system and accused of being fake, as opposed to this Roman legionary made it slightly differently because they felt like it. And
this is where we say that how many Imperial Gallic helmets are there in part or in whole? Maybe 100, probably less.
Something like that.
Yeah. And how many types are there? There's at least 15.
Goes to K.
K.
And again, that's applying a sort of modern classification system, which almost certainly the Romans didn't have, because I'm sure there was a lot of on-the-fly innovation and adaptation as circumstances and skills dictated. But it's part of our world that we like to classify, control, put in pigeonholes, because that's how we understand our world these days. And I suppose that's why we're experts. We can assign names and labels to things which the ancient peoples probably find mighty strange.
I always find that with pottery, the Beasley way of defining pieces of pottery. And it's like, well, I don't know that the ancients, no ancient literary source mentions pottery. So it's very hard to sort of turn around and say, this is a that, this is a that, this is a that.
But it's easily done.
It is. Oh, look, you can categorize anything. I think that's one of the problems, but that's not to say that that's how they categorize them. I don't think people walked around talking about an LG 2A, wine jug. They just had a wine jug, and it might have been old and it might have been new, but that's how it works.
It might have been bigger than yours, yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. It holds more wine. But I think also there's that issue with when you've got the categorization, and we sit there and think that's a very modern idea, that we talk about things in terms of age of revolution or this period or that period. And then you go back to the ancient world, and they did the same thing by talking about things in terms of a particular Olympiad. When they talk about regnal years for either kings or tyrants, we still use those in several ways. We can still talk about the diamond jubilee of a queen or a king and things like that. So there's also some continuity with the way that the ancient world thought. And I mean, one of the fascinating things reading ancient texts, whether it's Aristophanes or Thucydides or Herodotus or Livy, I'll better name a Roman source, when you read them, how remarkably similar to us they are. You can read Cicero, you can read Juvenal, and you can find people and characters in those writings that are so very in tune with the way we would like to think we thought, that in a way you can understand why people think they are Roman or think they are Greek, because of the continuity of attitude, and that's a really interesting and dangerous thing, because you can find that being
perceived continuity of
yes.
I think there's also the danger that you might have a a false sense of familiarity with certain topics from the ancient world, be it especially weaponry, with the whole influence of film and media today. And I think that's where one of the great aspects of reenactment, that you can actually bring people back down to what is fact, what is fiction. But even then, I found it interesting that I looked on a website a couple of weeks ago of one of the manufacturers here in the UK of reenactment gear, and they were advertising their best-selling tunic is not something that's based on anything from the ancient world, but actually is based on the tunics produced for the film of the Ninth Legion.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
subsequently,
Well,
and they're saying, oh, but these are the most popular ones, that all reactors are going for. It's it's that battle against what the media is producing in an image that's educating or miseducating people.
Yeah, and I think that, Mark, that comes down to, in a sense, then the degree to which the society prides itself on doing authenticity. So, for example, the very first Ermine Street Guard had the fine intention of raising money for a village hall in Gloucestershire, and they raised their money. And at some point, I think the law is that somebody got in touch with Russell Robertson in the Tower of London, and they were sort of said, well, actually, you've gone this far in building the stuff. Why don't you actually build the stuff properly? And over the next 10, 15 years, they replaced all their fiberglass helmets and their sort of aluminium stuff with what they wear today. And that's been quite a transformation. And I think that what that means is that there's a commitment. I go back to this point: commitment to authenticity, and the bias, if you like, is to be conservative. And if you want to build a new dagger, for example, you can't just simply show up at a display and here's my new dagger. No, you've got to go before the committee, and the committee wants to see the evidence on which you've based the choice of dagger if you've made it that way, and you have to come up with an archaeological drawing or whatever it is. So that's the approach of that society. I can't speak for other ones. I do suspect that other ones probably follow a similar discipline, simply because there's competition even between some of these groups now, and a lot of them are coming together in these big events. And from what I've seen, I think in Nîmes and Arles, some of the great festivals they can turn out hundreds of people. Are very impressive to watch now, and just seeing the video clips, because it's many years since I've been to one. There's a Project Gemina in the Netherlands, which is certainly on a par with the Ermine Street Guard for its attention to detail. But when you see these, it's quite overwhelming, and it leaves a lasting impression when you see people forming up the testudo and actually seeing that it actually works. It's not something just sketched in a drawing somewhere. And in fact, sometimes because the drawing is not well executed, you could say, see, this is where the artists get it wrong. You have to handle it this way, and it can do those things. But the artist got it wrong. He was briefed wrong. The creative brief wasn't accurate.
It's a nice bridge that you gave the opportunity for here, Lindsay, because I think we can establish that indeed the best groups really do try to get the equipment right. But of course, that's part one. You get all the kit right and you put it on a guy, then what? And that's where, of course, it gets a lot more difficult, because we have no, if we're just continuing on, early Imperial Roman legionaries and auxiliaries, there's no surviving order book. We don't know what the commands were. I remember on Roman Army Talk, we had an enormously long discussion about whether they walked in step or not. They marched in step or not. And I think the conclusion was, well, it sort of goes naturally, but that still doesn't mean that they did it on purpose. Although, and then, people with military experience might say, well, exercise helps. But there you might, I'm not saying there is, but it could be that modern bias introduces itself. Because, something that has been done in modern militaries since they started to exercise their troops to instill discipline and teach them how to move in formation, that's been done for about 300 years now, I think. Does that mean that the Romans did it the same way? Even if some of the inspiration about how to move your troops might have come from earlier and later Roman handbooks.
Well, it's hard to know. Murray is the expert on handbooks. I'll just throw this into the mix. I think that we know that there were 2 paces of march, and I think that implies some kind of organization in marching people at different speeds. The other thing I was going to say is that there is this cult of disciplina in the Roman army, which also kind of gives you a context, a sort of cultural reference point. So they're clearly indiscipline is not acceptable. So discipline probably implies all these other sorts of things. I suppose where it might break down is when you have that account of the expedition of Varus going off, being sort of led by Arminius and his troops. There's that intermingling of the civilian camp followers in with the army, and you can only imagine that those people are not going to be marching. They're going to go as fast as whatever their slowest mule is, I suppose, or the donkey. So under those circumstances, maybe there wouldn't have been so much disciplina. And in fact, I think the subtext in that story that Cassius Dio relates is the fact that Varus didn't attend to the basic disciplines. And that's why he got into a mess. If he'd actually followed the handbook, assuming there was one, he would have actually limited his gullibility, and there wouldn't have been the great disaster.
I think it's obvious from, I mean, not to head off Murray, but it's clear from it's clear from handbooks. There must have been orders and instructions, because otherwise you can't form a phalanx. You can't do what the handbooks say that phalanxes could do. The difficulty is not sort of knowing that they existed, but then how do you adapt that to your reenactment group, where you probably don't have, they're going to be people who've been practicing on doing, reenacting a Roman soldier or a Greek soldier or a Hellenistic soldier, some kind of ancient soldier, over many weekends, over perhaps many years, but that's still not the same as doing it for a living.
Well, let me tell you that, Jasper.
In probably not groups as big as, say, Centuria.
It's amazing how quickly. It's really amazing how quickly people, I got to say, get the rhythm. So, for example, I mean, everybody starts as they come as a member of the audience, and they think this is great fun, and they hang around at the end and say, "Well, why don't you come to the next display?" And then they put you in, and you literally have to learn on the fly. I mean, there might be a little bit of drill, but you learn how to march syndex, and you know what intente means, and you know what.
That's not what I mean, Lindsay.
Oh, okay.
I believe you can. Yeah, I believe you can teach a group to do a thing.
Yeah.
That's been shown many times. The question is, what are you teaching the group? Are you when you're teaching the group to do a thing? Are they doing what the Romans would have done? And how do you know that that's what they did do? And I know that a lot of reenactment groups put in a lot of effort to try and figure it out. But I'm just trying to get at what are the limits here?
Well, the bottom line is that you don't know, right? I mean, we just don't know. No, that's the honest truth. And I think that most guardmen can tell you that we're operating with the limits of known knowledge. The commands that were created for the guard unit were, I think, done in consultation with a historian, because nobody spoke Latin in the groups. They had to go to someone who could learn and speak Latin. But then again, you're trusting to their judgment now, right? Yeah. So now you've got a different kind of bias.
But I think it's not, again, it's that towering with a brush. It's that we often have a single piece of evidence from a particular period in time, from a literary perspective or an archaeological perspective, and we then extrapolate that out to cover all of ancient history, whether it be a piece of equipment, or whether it be a single incident of someone doing something and then going, for the rest of the period we don't know, therefore did they do it? So we know from the Greek handbooks that they had orders, and there's some really lovely specifics in the orders which say, if you're going to order a countermarch, don't start your order with the word countermarch, because people won't know what the countermarch is, because they'll go, which one is it? So you've got 3 types of countermarch. You've got Macedonian, Laconian, and Cretan or Choreos. So you say Macedonian countermarch as your order. So that's kind of like, well, that's very obvious now you've said it, but not necessarily. And we still have it. We have it in about face. We don't have it in, that's still present in modern order systems. So that's the Greek Tactica that have that, and that starts with Aeneas Tacticus and then Pyrrhus of Epirus. There's no corresponding Roman version of that till much, much later. And so there must have been orders, as you said, Jasper, and we've got a Greek model for how orders were ordered. Is it such a big step to go, well, this is what the Greeks did, and we have a piece of evidence to say that, therefore, if we translate those orders into Latin and make them specific to the legion as opposed to the phalanx, a countermarch is a countermarch. If a phalanx or a legion,
I'm just playing devil's advocate. I mean,
right, absolutely. No, I'm just saying that if we were to argue that literarily, if I was to write an article saying we have Greek orders, how much of a stretch is it for us to say these got translated into Latin and used as the orders for the legion?
And we have late Roman orders too.
We have late Roman orders, and we have Byzantine orders, which are based on the Greek. But the interesting thing there is there would be historians who would say, yes, that's fine, you've made a good case. There would be others who would say, no, you've pushed speculation too far. I need you to rewrite footnote 7. The anonymous reader requires that you.
And this is the interesting thing about reenactment. It's a sort of it's the next step from illustration. And when we make an illustration for ancient warfare, you have to make choices. You can't say we don't know this part, just leave it out. And same thing. And the next step goes for reenactment. You've got all these guys; they're wearing the right kit. But you can't just tell them to be like a modeling dummy. You have to do something, and we know they did something. You're going to have to find a way to do it. Which is interesting because it can teach you this works with a big group of people. This doesn't work. This makes everybody stumble. That is effective.
And even as Lindsay was talking about, how you can move, the assumption of these pieces of armor being cumbersome and being unable to maneuver or raise your right arm or whatever, and then you find that when you've built one or worn one, that actually you can do quite remarkably flexible things with it, which again, unless you've done that, you're not going to appreciate. We're very good at saying this is what the sources tell us, but we don't think that's even possible. As opposed to when you look at the cataphract armor on the Sarmatians on Trajan's column, they are head to toe in scale armor, and we sit there and go, no, that's not possible. That's an artistic convention. And then someone makes one.
And to take exactly that theme, for example, the saddle is a classic example, I think, where reconstructions. And again, it was Connolly who kind of was pushing the envelope on this one. With the four horns and trying to understand how they're used. And of course, the mythology was, well, no, Roman soldiers, of course, they rode ponies. They're very small horses. And of course, they had to trot because, they didn't have any stirrups and all this sort of stuff. And it turns out that you can actually get quite a gallop going with the Roman four-horned saddle. And then you combine that with the magnificence of the cavalry armor as well. And then you not only have the experience of a high-speed charge, but you've got this extraordinary image of what an armored cavalryman would look like, and it's quite frightening. You see several of those, and then you combine that with the display of precision spear throwing or javelin or whatever it is you have as your weapon, and again, people walk away with the number of mythologies dispelled and blown up, and I think that's a very positive thing.
You can have that, but I've seen quite the opposite happen at a display that happened 7 years ago or so at where was that, Dover Castle, where they had a reenactment for some cavalry plus the racing chariot and whatnot. But I think everything was sort of done in such a slow and obviously cautious and going by health and safety and whatnot. So I think a lot of the audience sort of went away and said, "Gee, ancients, they couldn't really do much, did they?" So
well, of course, the ancients didn't have health and safety rules.
It depends on who you're watching and the circumstances of the reenactment and whatnot.
Well, that's where you get that really interesting thing that's been around for a long time. But there was a new video of Indonesian light javelin throwing cavalry from a couple of years ago, posted on Facebook just this week, and no stirrups. horseback, throwing light javelins without any issues at a gallop. And it's sort of one of those things that, desk-bound historians used to say, that's impossible. You can't do that from horseback. Now, some of those historians, of course, had probably had horsemanship experience, and they possibly had the experience of being in some form of military system during, the middle of the 20th century. And they would turn around and go, you can't do these things. And then you see a tribal example of people doing exactly the things that we've been told are impossible. And you get people saying, well, hang on, if they can do it, surely it could be done. And it's our modern bias that, leads us to say there are things you can't do without stirrups. And then suddenly there's all these stories of people doing things without stirrups that we're like, well, that can't be possible. And then, like the Peter Connolly saddle reconstruction, prove you can. And it's again that I think that experimental aspect of it, that, well, we get told that they did this thing. We now get told that thing wasn't possible with our understanding of what they had to do it with. Surely the two must meet somewhere. Let's jump on a horse or grab a sword and try. And then you'll find a medium about, well, we can do that thing if we do these things based on, practical experimentation.
And I think that, and what that does then is temper the sort of the academic insistence that such and such work this way and only this way, because you say, well, we know that it's possible. At least you can then frame it in terms of, well, we don't know for certain it was used this way, but we know it, if you put these things this way, they behave in this form. So that then you become an informed historian rather than...
It's a counter argument against academic assumptions that just say a man can't do this. And the answer might be, well, yes, because you are desk bound and don't walk 15 miles a day every day and haven't done that since, age 5.
And on that same note, by the way, I think the people who have actually worn armor for any length of time come away with it with a great respect when you actually begin to think, hold on, a Roman battle lasted this many hours or so, and they're carrying this equipment and then the heat and what have you. You come away when you do the drill maneuvers and the things that certainly in my experience you would do, you get tired really quickly. This stuff is heavy. And certainly when you combine the scutum, which itself is something like 10 feet. I mean, for example, this is yours truly, many years ago, right? Okay, so this is what we do, and we give the display with showing the pedum and somebody would do that way, and that shield alone is bloody heavy, if I may say so in French. And the fact that you are in a battle scenario and you read the accounts of from dawn through till dusk, it's a competition of stamina, except that of course not all combatants are fighting all of the time, so that kind of tempers that insight. But you do come away with a great respect for these men for being physically strong, tough, mentally as well as physically, I should say.
But it's insights as well, like in terms of the holding of the scutum, in terms of how comfortable that is over a length of time as well, isn't it?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because depending on the position of this umbo, right, that thingy there, where's that? There, like that.
The shield boss.
The shield boss has a bar on the inside. So in fact, you're not holding it like this; you're holding it like this.
No, but the one I've got one in mind.
This on the podcast, Lindsay, so you'll have to explain it.
Okay, so think of a dome, and on the inside of the dome there is a bar that runs across basically the diameter
horizontally.
Perfect. If it's perfectly positioned within the cut hole of the scutum, it can be realistically modestly comfortable. The fact
that
is,
was what I was thinking of. Yeah. The one I've got in my classroom at the moment, I don't know if the hole is really that well positioned, because if you are holding it for any length of time, you start to find that it is sort of getting, starting to get into your wrist, into the top of your wrist, sort of thing.
I remember the agony and the ecstasy of being in Autun in France. We had the march up the main street, the high street in Autun, which is a magnificent town, by the way. And I happened to have got the awkward positioned umbo, and I tell you what, the blood starts to stop reaching your fingers, And you can't just say, "Oh, stop! I need to put this down." You just have to carry on. And you have to wonder, per the earlier remarks of Jasper about the quality and the consistency of design of equipment, there probably was some pretty crappy equipment in use. And you see some reenactors, they wrap cloths and all this sort of stuff, and there you're getting into the realm, I think, of necessity rather than historical accuracy. But these are human factors, right? These are things you have to bear in mind. And we hear that there were shoulder straps and various sort of things. And I would imagine they just get in the way if you're actually trying to use those in the combat.
But I think it's also about... Go.
I think that insights into how battles were fought is one of the great advantages of reenactment and experimental archaeology. So, for example, in the 1980s, the Hellenic Navy built a replica trireme named the Olympias, and it was crewed with modern rowers. And some of the things that they discovered, and these were not professional rowers, often they were rowers, whomever was willing to pull an oar, is that their speeds that they achieved, for example, roughly a 6-knot cruising speed, maybe 7 knots, that would have been very useful for battle, a 9-knot sprint speed for ramming. These speeds tallied relatively well, especially the 6-knot cruising speed, with recorded voyages. So we discovered that the speeds that a crew could achieve were actually very similar to what an ancient crew of a trireme did. And another insight that I think was really fascinating was that they practiced getting an entire crew of 200 rowers and ancillary crewmen aboard a ship as quickly as possible, and using 2 gangplanks to board, the Olympias was able to take on its entire crew in roughly 90 seconds, and get seated at the oar and put the oars out. So one of the things that experiment shows is that several battles in the ancient world, for example, most famously probably Aegispotami, but others, were decided by a fleet that was beached, meaning all the triremes had been taken ashore, were surprised by the enemy, caught at the beach and destroyed. And what this the 90-second boarding speed showed was that it was not necessarily then the inability to get your crew onto the ship itself that kept you beached. It was that they probably, especially the Athenians at Aegispotami, allowed their crewmen to wander far and wide. They didn't maybe to go find food, or just simply to didn't have them close to hand. And that's why when the Peloponnesians showed up, the Athenians just could not get off the beach. So that I thought was a very interesting point, and it shows why it was just very difficult for some fleets to react quickly. Is not that actually, if you have all your men at hand, getting them on the ship was the difficulty part. It was actually keeping them somewhere within a few hundred yards. In the case of surprise, that was the problem.
And taking that comment there about the boat, in fact, a German shipyard built the small boat which is called the Victoria, and it's been rowed up and down the Lippe River quite a lot, and it's crewed, I think, by a reenactment group who actually wear full kit. And the extraordinary is they're completely kitted out in lorica segmentata and their helmets, and they're happily rowing a fair number of knots. And the revelation they had was the very tight turnaround that you could actually have with the boat. So these craft, combining your comments there, are quite nimble with a trained crew. And by the way, they didn't wear life belts and things. So I just want to
go down quickly in lorica.
I would imagine so.
No, the Lippe is not a very big river.
The other thing I think is that coming back to that idea about industrialization that we've got, we know from one of the anecdotes in Julius Caesar that his soldiers customized their armor and arms, and there's a ban on the customization at some point. And I think that idea that you're talking about, the uncomfortable umbo, that the Roman would do the human thing to make it comfortable and make it a comfortable fit. We've got several anecdotes and stories of people recycling armor. There's the army of Spartacus arming itself from the Roman legions they defeated. There's the army of the Goths in the late 4th century, arming themselves from the Roman legionaries. Hannibal, you can be sure that they customized those shields and things like that to fit their own hands. And I think that the problem we've got with an industrial ideology is that one size fits all. You know, a Roman shield's a Roman shield, as opposed to, well, no, there would be variation between who built it and also who built it for whom. You know, if your hand's not big enough to fit in the hole will be made bigger. If that's your shield, you will make the hole fit your hand. You won't go, oh, my hand doesn't fit. Yeah. I will compromise by shoving my hand into it and making me unable to operate.
So here's an example.
Sure that somebody's looked at helmets with multiple owner inscriptions. I sort of vaguely recall having read sometime that there is evidence of adaptations, but I might just be completely misremembering that.
I think that there's one where they actually found that they trimmed off part of the base of the helmet, because for the person who had actually inherited that, it just was too big. And I have to say, one of the fun things with reenactment, when you start up as a tyro, as a novice, if you will, you by definition have to inherit somebody else's armor, and you have to find ways to compromise it. The helmet doesn't quite fit. And one of the raging arguments often is, did they have padding? Did they have a little kind of like what was like a Jewish
arming cap?
Yeah, and nobody knows. I don't think anything of that survives to know these things. But I can tell you.
I think there is one or two examples of helmets with some felt stuck in the bowl.
Because I can tell you, if you wear that thing that's blooming hard on the head.
Moreover, if you look at the surviving helmets, they're very, very thin.
Yeah.
So
a blow to that, it offers no protection effectively.
Exactly.
It's really for glances and deflection. Rather than complete blows. Now, what was funny, we had an infantry guard member who was actually very close to our Onagger, which is the wild ass armor, single-armed stone-throwing device. And he got a bit too close, and this thing whacked the side of his helmet, which meant that his ear guard got dinged, and he wore that with great honor. Because I've actually got an actual genuine war
battle damage.
So presumably, if we look closely at some of those helmets in museum collections, we'll see evidence of actual combat.
There's evidence of repairs and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say the examples of the Olympias and the other rebuilt ships. There's several now floating around in Germany. There's actually an article in the latest Ancient Warfare, and they make advances every time. What Mark said about getting on board a ship, the disadvantages, and I think the more we study ancient warfare, the more we see that morale is an important factor. Is that is the hardest thing to recreate in a reenactment. You can't, if you're in a group of reenactors, you're probably excited and having a good time, but you're not. But you don't have fear of imminent death.
Let me give you two little kind of anecdotal stories then. So one thing is that when you've got three performances and there's one at like 11 and one at 1 and one at 3, and you've in the meantime had to lug this equipment around and load the truck. What's amazing is you find an inner resource, right, which actually comes from the group of doing that one last performance, and it's a bit like that when you hear that the commander calls on his men one more time, and you sort of find the inner resources even though you're absolutely exhausted. The other side I wanted to throw at you is that many, many years ago, when we were actually in a Swiss valley, and I forget the name of the town, and we were actually performing in a football stadium. That's European football, not American. And what was intriguing was that this was like a floodlit performance. So we were all in our magnificent armor, and we had our standard bearer and our horn player. And out of nowhere came this group of students who decided that they were going to be local Gaelic barbarian people, obviously. And they charged us. And I have to say, for the first time ever, I understood what it means to be berserk. They had appeared and they had taken either the horn or the signum. I can't remember what it was they took. I think maybe it was the horn. And when this news swept through the ranks, they've taken our cornu. You have to imagine the fury that swept through this. And when our centurion gave the order, in Pente, the full button, it was precision. And there wasn't much left of the barbarian costumes by the time we'd finished. Nobody got hurt. And I remember the old chap, Bill Mays, who was our signifer, who was already in his 60s when he was even then, would never let the signum go. He swung this thing around it like it was a scythe to make sure these people never grasped it. And it was fascinating to me. So those two little insights, what I'm trying to say is that reenactment will never get you into the mindset of a Roman soldier. It can't. But you have these little things of understanding where you get those reserves of stamina and this sudden unit cohesion, if I could put it that way. Events cause these things to happen, and they're just fleeting examples, but I still remember them to this day.
I think it's also a sign of how keen we are as historians that those little moments of insight are informative to us as historians. The interesting one that you get, I was watching the rugby, and I apologise to Mark McCaffrey, that was that the All Blacks, have yet again are favourites for the World Cup, despite not being first in the rankings. But the Australian commentators were on last night talking about that the morale of the Australian rugby team getting used to beating the All Blacks, and the All Blacks not having an aura of invincibility about them. They were talking about how the under-20s had defeated them, and how the another schoolboy team had defeated the Wallaby schoolboy team had defeated the All Black schoolboy team. And so it was the idea that what you find in rugby circles is that the All Blacks have an aura of invincibility about them. So if anyone gets on the field with them, they expect to lose. And that mindset, that morale going into battle, as it were, will automatically make you not play as well. And we have many instances of that in ancient warfare. Mm-hmm. We also have the exceptions where that invincible unit is defeated, and that's either the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of warfare, or it's kind of like they got defeated again, depending on the morale of the time. And one of the remarkable things about Roman warfare is how quickly they are able to bounce back, and the massive ego of several of the generals, whether it be a Marius or a Scipio Africanus or a Julius Caesar, that they say, no, well, I'm different. I won't get beaten, even though we've been beaten this many times before. And I think that, again, when you're an ancient historian, and certainly I know I'm an ancient military historian, when I'm watching rugby commentators and all I'm thinking about is the parallels between that and Greco-Roman military history, it's quite weird.
Yeah. I just remembered the place. It was called Martigny. So La Bataille de Martigny. That's what it was.
All right. Well, I wanted to. There was one question that was very different, which I wanted to discuss. Somebody suggested. Don't have the name right here. What does augmented reality? What can augmented reality bring in this? Can we reenact perhaps in Roman kit and everybody in these special glasses, and can that make us, you could make it feel like there's an actual army of Helvetii, to stay with Lindsay there, coming at you? Would that make a difference? Can we learn more from that?
Well, I'm going to say, first of all,
maybe we'll have to ask somebody who knows a lot about augmented reality about that. Actually,
well, I've got a friend who works in VR.
Me too.
VR. Mm.
I was going to say that, for example, that I think Total War has actually changed the way that we understand the dynamics of the battlefield. I don't play that game, by the way, and I've only seen it on representations on TV. But if you were asking about the personal experience, I don't know, because I've looked at the quality of some of the graphics you get these days, and they're very sort of blocky and they're not terribly convincing. And I have to imagine that rate of progress in the hardware, in the software, in the image processing, or it will get us to a point where it'll be hard to distinguish between real and made up. And that will be very exciting. So it then comes down to the artistry and the programming of the coder, because if you think about it, it's an invented product. You put in the code to behave this way in those circumstances to get that visual. So you have to hope that the animator, that the coder, is actually informed by the historical knowledge to know that the equipment works in that way. Otherwise, it's just a set of assumptions that they're as bad or as good as everybody else is in real life.
The simulation, I think, will only be as good as the quality of the information that's actually put into it. I can imagine, maybe decades from now, that the virtual reality will be so good that it will be indistinguishable or almost indistinguishable from reality. That being said, I think that, once again, the benefit will be if it allows us to perhaps obtain insights into how battles were fought that are not immediately apparent from the way we will look at a map and see the soldiers in long lines facing each other across a field. What you might be able to do is have get the sensation of what would it be like to be a Macedonian phalangite going into battle carrying a sarissa. And one of the things that I get lost, or at least overlooked, in the way we think about ancient battles is how limited the vision of the individual soldier would have been. Especially a rear ranker would probably have been only able to see the backs of the men in front of him and maybe a little bit of what was going on in the enemy front ranks. He would not know what was going on much to the left or to the right of him. And that's why, presumably, when you see battles where momentous events were taking place on the flank and yet no one else really reacted to it, is because no one else could see it. That might be a real benefit, a visceral sense of what it was like to march into battle, do battle against an enemy, what it would be like maybe to deal with a charge of Gauls as a Roman legionary. That'll be something. But
you do get some insight of that from the actual physical reenactment. So, for example, in again, Illustrious Guard, it's about sort of 40 men. It's about 30 of those are. Yeah. It's the fact is that you can see the signum and you understand the importance of being able to visually see the cue, for it's now tilted up and it's to the right or the left or whichever it is, and the sound of the horn. And I know we've talked about this before, that if you can imagine across a battlefield where you've got a centuria, a century of 80 men, and each one of those has got the signum and the horn, it becomes a very noisy space. And above that, you've got shouts and cries and so on. It becomes very, very distracting.
Well, maybe we should ask a VR or augmented reality expert to discuss it with us on the show sometime.
I think the problem is, I don't want to be on a downer, but I don't know our economic power is such that there will ever be the demand for Roman and or Greek and or other ancient VR.
Don't underestimate us, but yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, there was no downer at all. The other issue I've found doing it is the idea that your brain can actually cope with VR is something that a lot of people who are working in VR have discovered, that 20 minutes in virtual reality, you're exhausted mentally and physically, and your brain, it may look real, but your brain is not processing it as a real thing. Your brain is doing a lot more work than it has to do in our surroundings as we walk around. And so I think the problem with those is that the actual exposure time of VR will always be limited because our brains won't be able to process the information.
On the other hand, it's very contrived, the whole, that it doesn't allow for, those mistakes or just, just those chance occurrences. One of the pieces of equipment I bought recently was a pilum, and, I decided to I was thinking, okay, where am I going to store this? How am I going to get to and from work? And I accidentally placed it with too much force into a plastic container, tube that I was using. And, just that accident and actually seeing how very nice and smoothly that sort of cuts straight through it down into the ground gave, it's just accidents that can give you insight into experience with equipment or weapons, etc.
Yeah.
And you're not going to find those things in VR because it's too
pre-programmed.
Yeah. And the problem, of course, is if there is a glitch that ruins the entire experience. For if there's one pixelation, then the whole thing's ruined, and you're like, well, no. But yeah. Anyway.
All right. Well, let's hope there's no glitches in this podcast.
Oh,
and we'll close with that. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, guys. We'll see you again in a month. In the meantime, if you are interested in Ancient Warfare magazine, you can find more information at ancient-warfare.com. And if you would like to support the podcast, you can do so on Patreon. Look for Ancient Warfare Podcast. And I think that's it. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.